In the darkness of the Pacific War, a hidden weapon pulsed through the airwaves. It wasn't a new kind of bomb or a secret fleet of planes. It was a language so obscure, so deeply rooted in the deserts of the American Southwest, that it baffled the brilliant minds of Imperial Japan. This weapon wasn't built in laboratories. It was carried in the memories, the voices, and the tongues of young Navajo men who would soon be known as Code Talkers. Their mission: send vital battle messages across chaotic war zones, messages the Japanese would hear but never understand, messages that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The story begins long before the jungles of Guadalcanal, before the sands of Iwo Jima. It begins with a question haunting the U.S. military in World War II. How do you send messages securely when your enemies seem to intercept and decode everything you transmit? By the early 1940s, the Japanese had already proven themselves skilled at breaking American codes. Cryptographers in Tokyo could decipher patterns, identify weaknesses, and within days, sometimes hours, unravel what the Americans tried so hard to conceal. U.S. commanders faced a nightmare scenario. Orders for attacks, troop movements, supply routes, all could be exposed, all could be used against them. Soldiers' lives hung on every transmission. Desperation sparked creativity. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way to communicate that machines and mathematical geniuses could not penetrate. And that's when someone remembered the Navajo. The Navajo Nation, stretching across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, was home to one of the most complex languages in the world. At the time, it was unwritten, filled with sounds and structures that outsiders struggled to grasp. Linguists called it one of the hardest languages to learn. For most of the Navajo people, their mother tongue was not just communication. It was identity, a sacred bond passed through generations. To the United States Marine Corps, it was something else entirely: the perfect code. The idea was radical: recruit bilingual Navajo men, train them as Marines, and then teach them to adapt their native language into a secure, fast, unbreakable system of battlefield communication. No cryptography machines. No long, time-consuming ciphers. Just voice, clarity, and speed. If it worked, commanders could send orders instantly across radios, and the enemy would never know what was said. But the Navajo language was not simply plugged into the battlefield as is. A secret code had to be built around it. Words from everyday Navajo speech were assigned military meanings. For example, the Navajo word for turtle came to mean tank. The word for chicken hawk became dive bomber. Even the Navajo alphabet was reshaped into a phonetic code, allowing them to spell out names and terms that didn't exist in their language. The result was extraordinary: a code hidden inside a language. Double protection. By 1942, the first group of 29 Navajo recruits, later celebrated as the original Code Talkers, was sent to Camp Pendleton in California. Many of them had never left their reservations. Some had never ridden a bus, never seen the ocean. Yet here they were, about to become the guardians of military secrets. They trained relentlessly, creating a code book that was memorized, never written down. Failure to remember could cost lives. Mastery meant survival, not just for them, but for entire units on the front lines. While the Marines embraced the experiment, not everyone was convinced. Some officers doubted whether such a strange and unscientific code could really hold against Japanese intelligence. After all, Japan's cryptographers were among the best in the world. But as soon as the Navajo Code Talkers began their first field tests, doubts melted away. Messages that once took hours to encode and decode to machines were now transmitted in minutes, even seconds. And when intelligence officers tried to break the Navajo transmissions, they hit an impenetrable wall. The sounds, the cadence, the meaning, it was all indecipherable to anyone who wasn't Navajo. For the Japanese, it was maddening. They intercepted countless Navajo-coded messages throughout the war. They recorded them, replayed them, sent them to their best language experts. Nothing worked. To them, it was gibberish, like hearing words from another planet. Rumors swirled among the Japanese command. Some thought it was a special kind of machine voice. Others suspected it was a secret dialect of English twisted into something alien. The truth was sitting right in front of them, but it was invisible. Because even if they had somehow kidnapped a Navajo speaker from the U.S., the code was so modified, so creatively designed, that it would still make no sense without the training of Marines. As the Pacific battles grew bloodier, the importance of the code talkers deepened. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Polilliu, and finally Iwo Jima. Each time American forces advanced across islands fortified with Japanese defenses, the Navajo voices carried critical orders, reinforcement requests, artillery coordinates, warnings of ambushes. Without them, chaos would have swallowed the battlefield. With them, U.S. Marines moved with uncanny precision. But behind this success was a bitter irony. Many of these young Navajo men had grown up in America that tried to erase their culture. As children, some had been forced into boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their own language. Teachers called it backward, primitive, something to be stamped out. And now, in the desperate crucible of war, the U.S. military was relying on the very thing it once tried to destroy. The language of the Navajo, nearly silenced, had become the shield of a nation. The Navajo recruits carried this knowledge with them. They knew their role was secret, known only to a few. They knew the price of failure. They knew that if captured by the enemy, they would be tortured for the code. Yet they kept going, fueled by duty, by honor, and by the ancient strength of their people. Each transmission wasn't just a message. It was survival encoded in syllables the enemy could never grasp. And so, as the Pacific War thundered on, a hidden battle unfolded on the airwaves. Radios crackled, static roared, and beneath it all, the voices of the code talkers spoke with calm urgency. To the Japanese, it was nonsense. To the Americans, it was salvation. And to history, it would become legend. But this is just the beginning. For the full scale of what the Navajo Code Talkers achieved and how their voices shaped the outcome of one of the deadliest wars in history, we must step deeper into the heart of the conflict. By the time the Code Talkers reached the front lines, the Pacific theater had become a brutal chessboard. Each island was a fortress, and each battle was a gamble where the wrong move could doom tens of thousands of men. The Marines needed speed, precision, and secrecy. The Navajo language gave them all three. Imagine a battlefield in 1943. Gunfire rattling, mortars exploding, radios buzzing with chaos. A commander calls for an urgent artillery strike to neutralize a Japanese machine gun nest hidden in the jungle. In most units, this would mean a long, complicated process. Drafting the message, encoding it, transmitting it, then waiting for someone to decode it at the other end. Minutes, sometimes hours, would pass. Time soldiers simply didn't have. But with the Navajo Code Talkers, the order was spoken instantly in Navajo, carried across the radio waves, and decoded by another code talker within seconds. Shells rained down on the Japanese position, almost before they had time to fire again. Lives were saved because the code worked at the speed of thought. One of the first real tests came during Guadalcanal. The savage 6-month campaign fought over a jungle island in the Solomon Chain. The Japanese were ferocious defenders, determined to hold every inch of ground. The Americans, exhausted and under constant attack, relied heavily on communication. It was here that the Navajo Code proved its worth beyond question. Reports, orders, requests for reinforcements, all passed through the Code Talkers' voices. Quick and flawless. Marines who once doubted the strange experiment now swore by it. Commanders began requesting Navajo operators for their units, insisting they were essential. What made it so effective was not just secrecy, but speed. Machines could encrypt and decrypt messages, but they slowed the flow of battle. The Navajo system was faster than anything else on the planet. In tests, Code Talkers could deliver a 3-line message in under 20 seconds. The same message, using conventional military cryptography, took half an hour. On the battlefield, those extra 29 minutes could mean annihilation or survival. But the Japanese weren't passive. They were listening. They had brilliant linguists, men who had studied English, Chinese, and dozens of Pacific dialects. They recorded the strange Navajo messages, hoping to find patterns. Yet the language was so complex and the code within it so ingeniously layered that even the best cryptanalysts in Tokyo hit dead ends. Navajo wasn't like English, with clear alphabets and predictable grammar. It was tonal, filled with sounds that outsiders could barely reproduce, let alone analyze. And when words like iron fish referred to a submarine or whale meant a battleship, the code became an impenetrable maze. It was more than language. It was a riddle only the Navajo themselves could solve. The enemy grew desperate. There were rumors, whispers among the Marines, that Japanese troops sometimes tried to capture Navajo men on the battlefield, suspecting them to be the mysterious voices they heard on the radio. Some code talkers were even mistakenly taken for Japanese by their own allies, their dark hair and skin causing confusion in the heat of combat. For this reason, each code talker was assigned a personal guard, someone to ensure they wouldn't be mistaken for the enemy or taken alive. If captured, they carried a heavy knowledge that they would be tortured, perhaps killed, for the code. Yet they kept transmitting, calm under fire, their voices steady as gunfire roared around them. One of the most dramatic moments came during the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. The island was a nightmare of black volcanic rock, tunnels, and dug-in defenders. Nearly 70,000 Marines stormed the beaches, facing 22,000 Japanese soldiers who had sworn to fight to the death. Communication was chaos. Radios jammed, wires cut, the battlefield a storm of confusion. But the Navajo Code Talkers stood firm. In just the first 2 days of fighting, they sent more than 800 error-free messages. Commanders later testified that without them, Iwo Jima might have been lost. Major Howard Connor, a Marine signal officer, famously declared, "Were it not for Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." That statement was an exaggeration. The Navajo Code Talkers weren't just sending words. They were shaping the very course of battle. Every artillery strike, every troop movement, every shift in strategy flowed through their voices. At Iwo Jima alone, 6 code talkers worked around the clock, transmitting messages non-stop for 48 hours. Exhausted, hoarse, and surrounded by death, they never faltered. Every message arrived intact. Every code remained unbroken. Beyond the battles, there are details that reveal just how ingenious the system was. The code wasn't static, it evolved. The original 29 men created a base dictionary of terms, but as the war expanded, so did the code. New weapons, new strategies, new names had to be added. By war's end, the vocabulary had grown to hundreds of terms, and all of it was memorized. No written copies, no books. If a code talker forgot, there was no backup. But they didn't forget. Their memories, trained and sharpened, were the vaults that kept America's secrets safe. Another fascinating fact, while other Native American languages were tested, Comanche, Choctaw, Lakota, the Navajo proved unique. Its sheer complexity made it ideal. At the time, fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the world could speak it fluently. Even among native languages, it was notoriously difficult for outsiders to master. The Marines had stumbled upon the perfect shield, one hiding in plain sight, spoken by people whose ancestors had walked the deserts and canyons of America for centuries. And yet, there's a haunting paradox here. Many of these men had grown up in a country that marginalized them. They lived in poverty on reservations, denied opportunities, often treated as second-class citizens. Some were punished as children for speaking Navajo in school. But in war, the very language that had been scorned became priceless. Without it, thousands more Marines might have died. Without it, victory in the Pacific could have been delayed or even jeopardized. The code talkers themselves rarely bragged about their role. They were Marines first, humble and disciplined. After missions, many kept silent, bound by secrecy. Their work was classified, their achievements hidden in official reports. When they came home, they didn't parade their stories. They returned to quiet lives, their voices carrying memories of war few could imagine. For decades, America never knew the depth of their contribution. It was a secret hidden not just from the Japanese, but from the world. But even in silence, their legend grew among those who served beside them. Marines who witnessed the code in action never forgot. They remembered the calm voices on the radio, the strange syllables that carried life-saving orders. They remembered how, in the worst moments, those voices never broke. And they knew, deep down, that without the code talkers, the Pacific War would have been far bloodier. By the final year of World War II, the voices of the Navajo Code Talkers had become the lifeline of the Pacific Campaign. From the decks of battleships to the foxholes carved into volcanic ash, their words carried orders that could turn the tide in moments. Yet as the Allies closed in on Japan, the demands on these young men only intensified. Every island was more heavily defended, every message more urgent, and still the code remained unbroken. Okinawa was the last great battle before the planned invasion of Japan itself. It was a brutal 82-day struggle that cost over 12,000 American lives and nearly 100,000 Japanese. Amid the chaos, the Code Talkers transmitted thousands of messages under fire. They directed naval bombardments, guided aircraft, and coordinated the movements of ground troops advancing through terrain soaked with blood. Once again, their transmissions were flawless. Every order arrived on time. Every code remained intact. At war's end, officers would marvel that in the entire conflict, not a single Navajo code was ever cracked. Not once. But even as victory drew near, the world-changing shadow of the atomic bomb began to loom. In August 1945, the United States dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender. For most Americans, this was the end of the story. The war was over. The soldiers would come home, and the nation would move forward. Yet for the Code Talkers, their work was far from finished. Their mission was buried beneath layers of secrecy. They had carried one of the most powerful weapons of the war, but they were forbidden to speak of it. When the surviving Code Talkers returned home, many found that no one understood what they had done. Families asked about their role, and all they could say was that they had been radio operators. Their voices had shaped history, yet their achievements remained invisible. Some returned to poverty on the reservations, struggling to rebuild lives in a country that still did not fully recognize them as equals. The irony was painful. They had risked everything to protect the United States, but in their own homeland, discrimination continued. For years, the truth stayed locked away. Military officials feared that the code might still be useful in future wars. If the Navajo language had worked against Japan, it could be used again against other enemies. And so the story of the Code Talkers was sealed as classified. The men who had saved thousands of lives, who had delivered victory in battle after battle, were sworn to silence. Only a handful of officers knew the full extent of their contribution. To the outside world, it was as if they had never existed. It was not until decades later, long after the war had faded into history books, that the curtain began to lift. In 1968, the Navajo Code was finally declassified. At last, the world learned what these men had done in the crucible of war. But by then, many of the original Code Talkers had already passed away, their stories untold. Those who survived spoke with quiet humility. They did not see themselves as heroes, but as Marines who had done their duty. Yet the nation now began to recognize the truth. They had been more than soldiers. They had been guardians of an unbreakable secret. Recognition came slowly. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day, honoring their legacy. In 2001, decades after the guns of the Pacific had gone silent, the original 29 Code Talkers were awarded Congressional Gold Medals, the highest honor the United States can bestow on civilians. Hundreds of others received silver medals. Ceremonies were held, flags waved, speeches made. But behind the applause was a haunting question. Why had it taken so long? What makes their story unforgettable is not just their military success, but the profound symbolism. The language of the Navajo had once been suppressed, ridiculed, nearly erased by policies that sought to force Native children to abandon their heritage. And yet, in the world's darkest hour, that same language became the key to survival. It was proof that what some had called weakness was in fact strength, that what was nearly destroyed was instead the very thing that saved lives. Even the Japanese, after the war, admitted defeat in the realm of codes. Their best cryptographers had tried and failed to crack the Navajo system. Historians later confirmed that no enemy codebreaker ever came close. The Code Talkers had achieved something unprecedented. They had created a communication system that remained unbroken from the first message to the last. In the entire history of warfare, such a record is almost unheard of. The legacy of the Code Talkers stretches beyond the battlefield. It is a reminder that power does not always lie in machines, in weapons, or in technology. Sometimes it lies in culture, in memory, in the voices of people who carry their history inside them. The Navajo men who fought were not just soldiers of the United States. They were representatives of an ancient nation, bringing their heritage into the heart of modern war. In doing so, they bridged two worlds, the traditional and the military, the ancient and the modern. Today, when we listen to recordings of their voices or read the stories of their service, we can almost hear the static of those wartime radios, the calm tones cutting through chaos. They were not dramatic or loud. They were steady, precise, unshakable. In those voices, there was no fear, only duty and the quiet knowledge that every syllable mattered. For the Japanese, those voices were a mystery they could never solve. For the Americans, they were a lifeline. For history, they became legend. The Navajo Code Talkers carried words that could not be broken, messages that could not be betrayed. In the end, they carried victory. And yet, their greatest message may not be found in the transmissions they sent across the Pacific. It is found in what their story teaches us today. That languages matter, that cultures matter, that no voice is too small to shape the fate of nations. In the deserts where their ancestors once spoke under the stars, the Navajo language lives on, strong, resilient, eternal, just as it was in the war, unbroken. So when we remember World War II, we often recall the storming of beaches, the roar of planes, the mushroom clouds rising over Japan. But hidden beneath that thunder was something quieter, a secret weapon, carried not in steel or fire, but in words. Words that no enemy could take, no enemy could twist. Words spoken by the Navajo Code Talkers, whose voices remain, to this day, the sound of the unbreakable.